talk. It's much appreciated. Security is a particular passion of mine, for those people that know me, as is architecture, and it's quite interesting for me to bring the two together. Quite unique opportunity to bring the two together. Security is quite often seen as a constraint. I don't agree with that. Security to me is an enabler. So, when I was asked to present, I thought about structure for this. I'm going to go through the whys. Why do we have to have security in architecture? What actually is security in architecture? How do we make security work? And then I'm going to throw it open to yourself and ask you when do you think that security should be considered within architecture. I've got my ideas about it, but I'd like to sort of seek your ideas about it as well. So, just let me come in a second. Okay. So, the first question is why? Why do we need to consider about security? Why can we not just build something? Security's got three common areas that I think most people are probably aware of: confidentiality, integrity, availability, CIA. You've also got non-repudiation and authentication, which both relate to integrity and confidentiality. They're both sort of subsets of that. Confidentiality is, we've all got personal information out in the general domain. I'm sure we all want to make sure that our personal information is kept confidential. We don't want people sharing it. Integrity, we want people saying the right things about us. We don't want information being taken and being returned or being misused in anything. Availability is about making sure that data is available to the right people at the right time. Security has got four strands. Security is commonly thought of as being technical, and quite often you'll find the security manager reports with the IT manager, the CTO, that type of route. Security has actually got four strands. Technical is just one strand. It's got physical, which is probably the most important strand of it. Where is that information being accessed from? How is it being accessed from? Where's the asset control? Do you know where all the information is being accessed from for you? Personnel. Personnel are probably our biggest risk, are the individuals that are managing our data. They're the biggest risks. Either in terms of ringing somebody up to say, did you know this about so-and-so? Or passing information on, or being careless, leaving printed copies out on photocopiers. I'm sure we've all been there, we've all seen it. Personnel are our biggest risk. Procedural. Organisations do need to take responsibility to say how they expect data to be managed. This is setting the foundations for how this fits into the architecture going forward, but these are the four areas that really cover, security is forms of four pillars for. So, I'm moving on to the why now. I've done the hows. I'm moving on to the why. Why have security in architecture? Why not just go and build something? Why not just go and build a system? Why not just go and build an infrastructure? Security will take care of itself. Or we'll do it afterwards. We'll do it at the end. Security architecture is a unified security design. In my opinion, it needs to be there at the start, so it can be built into it. Design principles need to be reported clearly and in depth, and it needs to be, it's a unified security design with principles. If you've got the principles in there, you know how it's going to be designed, you know how it's going to be built. The what? So it's about risk management. It's about managing the risks of data. Technology is actually quite relevant in all of this, but what's really important is the data that the technology is managing. It's the data that's the important part. Financial, budgetary, and legal regulatory. I do know of some organisations that have decided not to pay any attention to following DPA. They may change their minds when GDPR comes in, but with DPA they're saying the fines are not significant enough for them to warrant them They'd rather continue and carry the regulatory risk and regulatory fines rather than comply with regulatory. They don't state this down, but it's fairly common knowledge. There are some organisations out there that make that decision. But it needs to be on there. It needs to be a business decision whether or not they're going to follow regulation. Further what? How do we make sure, so this comes directly from TOGAF, how do we make sure that security is embedded in architecture? This is an example set of principles, and I'm sure you're all aware of the requirement for architectural principles, of which there's a big set which are data principles. And if you just remember what I've just said about this data that's important, it's not necessarily technology, protecting the data here. So there's a big set of data principles in there, and the one I've pulled out is obviously data security. So data security is about the open sharing of information, and again we go back to that word, information. Data stroke information. It's not technology, it's about open sharing of information. It does go on to say it's about balanced relevant legislation. Again, that's an organisational business decision whether or not we follow the legislation, but it needs to be considered business-wise. And availability of classified information. So the information needs to be available. Budgetary pressures come in there as well, but again, that's an organisational decision. So I'll come on to the next point, and remember the 4 points I identified. How? Attributes of security architecture. So you've got 3 main attributes. I've come on at the end of this slide, I've identified 4 different approaches, which are generic-ish approaches. You probably recognise all of them, but the generic-ish approaches into how we can integrate security into infrastructure, architecture. So you've got the relationships and the dependencies, the benefits, why we're doing this, full security architecture associated with IT architecture, but it is separate to IT architecture. So the first approach is something I'm sure you're all familiar with, OESA. This is based on principles. So it's policies. It's policy-driven security. It's not a constrained security. It's not built for you. It's policies. The organisation sets some architectural policies, and those policies are followed through. Of which one set of policies. So the policies form 3 parts: governance, technology, and system operations, or service management, as we touched on this morning. Under service management, you've got security. Whether security fits into there, or whether security is a big picture or not, I'm not sure. I would question. But there are 3 pillars. Governance, principles, policies, standards. So the next one is the one that I actually find most interesting. The secure collaboration-oriented architecture. This is about, if I get this word right, deperimetized operations, which is basically when we're starting to look at the boundaries. So traditionally, when you've looked at architecture and you've looked at security within it, people say, you've got to have this firewall, you've got to have this here, you've got to have this, you've got to protect your boundaries. What we're finding more and more now is that people, organisations are starting to blur those boundaries. So as you move into cloud, you've got third parties accessing data, using your data. The data is being used across, and we've already had a couple of questions about, could this data, this medical data be used elsewhere? Could we do some analysis on this data? I know from the work that I've done that a lot of the medical data can be used in the funding management public sector environment. There's a lot of crossover. But because NHS and the funding management are seen as separate entities, it's difficult to share the data. Going forward, I think these boundaries are going to become more and more blurred. This is what we're seeing at the moment, and this is why we're starting to have so many attacks. Because the boundaries are getting blurred, but we don't really understand how to still protect the data that's within those boundaries. It's an area that I find quite interesting, and I think it's very, very challenging. And I think it's an area that we're going to go move more and more towards. So we started off many years ago for those of you that still remember. We started off with standalone, a computer in a room, and one person went and logged into it. We then moved on to one or two people began to go and log into it, and they sort of started to share information. We then moved on to what's called the distributed client servers, where multiple computers, people are able to log into multiple computers, but still within this constrained environment. We then moved on to secure-orientated architecture, where you start to relax the protocols, and then we're moving on to cloud, where we are merging the boundaries of SAPSA. I'm sure most of you all have heard of SAPSA. There's certainly a white paper SAPSA out there. I've chosen this one because I've tried to choose 4 different approaches in terms of architecture. So to give a generic approach across the whole board. So these are not ones that have to be used, but it just gives a generic approach across the whole board. So SAPSA looks at a layered approach of architecture. So they have context. You start off with context when you're looking at architecture. You go on to the concept, go on to the logical design, the physical design, and the component design. But going all the way through that, so all the way through those layers, is security and service management. And they're going all the way through that. It's quite an interesting one, but I think the model needs to be adjusted because I think it's still quite constrained. I don't see how that model can go forward when you talk about boundaries, depyramidised boundaries. And I will get rid of see that by the end of this. That's quite an interesting model, but it's just another model to consider. The final model is actually, it's probably one closest to Louise's, it's a government model. So this is where the architectural risk assessment, where the architects themselves look at the risk. But it's in government, it's led by the Cabinet Office. So the Cabinet Office have got a published list of architectural principles for different levels of security that are being delivered. And they're open, so anybody can go and access them. But if you're delivering anything that's public sector, as a private sector organisation, you should go and refer to those, because then you can deliver against those levels of security, data security. But these are what the Cabinet Office have decided, Cabinet Office architects have decided are appropriate. So they're not really following any of the models, they're doing it as their perception of risk assessment. I think that one's quite open, well I know that one's very open to criticism at the moment. So one of the drivers behind that is something called PSN. I don't know if anyone come across PSN, which is it's a form of security around the perimeter of an environment that the government insists on if you're going to be sharing data with the government. PSN is known, it's in the general domain really, PSN will be disappearing because it's very, very constrained, it's very expensive for third parties, and it doesn't really address the true risks. It's not really moved on with security and risks and things like that. So that whole approach is being looked at the moment. How to achieve and support security design. So I started to look at security architects, and then I've gone on to the enterprise architects to try and understand how the two fit together. So this slide is looking at security architects and what they need to do. In my modelling, I see security architects reporting through to the enterprise architects, because enterprise architects need to see the whole picture, the whole business picture. But security architects also need to focus on the security side, but they need to see wider than just technology. If we go back to the 4 principles of security, policy, personnel, technical, and procedural, they need to see all of that, because it may very well be that there's something that's being handled physically, under physical security, which means that you don't need to put a technical constraint in there. So a good example of that would be when I've worked in the police, for example. They've put 2 or 3 barriers, and they've put very, very strict access control into certain systems, which means that, or they put 2 or 3 physical barriers in there, which means that the actual barriers to get into the system you can reduce. You don't have to have as many access levels to get into the systems. So to achieve this is what I would expect security architects to be looking at. I would be expecting security architects to interact with senior stakeholders across departments, research and apply innovative security architecture. Security architecture is moving on. There's a lot going on in this world at the moment. There's been quite a few well-publicised attacks that I'm sure you've all heard of. And there's been a lot of challenges. And the other thing that with security architecture is to understand the motivation behind it. So traditionally you think of people attacking for monetary reasons. With security, it's as much about kudos. You get the teenage kids that want to attack. So you've got to think about why you're looking to attack. So you've got credit controls in there. Vision and principles and strategy for security architects. That's quite an obvious thing for them to have to do. They need to look at the subtle security needs. So you've got your very commonplace, like your firewalls, etc. But there's subtle things in there. Do you need encryption? Where do you need encryption? Why do you need encryption? Do you need that sort of thing in there? And you need to look at the type of data you're holding, but you also need to look at the amount of data, because the more data that you're actually holding, the higher the risk comes into application, so the higher the risk. You need to understand all that side of it as well. I'm not going to go through each of these one by one, but I would expect a security architect to recommend security controls. I would expect the security architect to take the ownership of communicating with other stakeholders. So that's other stakeholders around the business and around third parties that they're engaging with, not just within the business. So one of the things with security is if you're sharing your data with third parties, you need to be sure that that data is being held and transmitted and managed as effectively as you're doing within your organisation. And that can be done procedurally, it can be done technically, but you have to have that assurance. And I would expect the security stakeholder, the security architect to have that understanding and not just to see the way the data is being held within your own organisational environment. Advise on key security-related technologies. Inspire, that's a good word. So security is traditionally quite boring. People switch off when you talk about security. They say, it's not me, I'm fine. Nobody's fine. We all inadvertently give out passwords. How many of you have got your date of birth as your password, for example? Or your daughter's or your son's name, or something like that? There'll be something somewhere that you've got, which is... but inspire people. The best way I've found of engaging with people with security, when you're sort of saying to them, you can't do this, I can't let you do this because it's going to open up this security risk, is to go and talk to them and to bring them on board. That's the best way I've found of bringing them on board and making them understand it. So the next slide looks at, so if you remember I said that in my opinion, and this is open for challenge, but in my opinion, the security architect reports through to the enterprise architect. Enterprise architect's got the full picture, security architect's just got one arm of it. So you've also got your technical architect, and you've got your solutions architect going through to the enterprise architect. So the enterprise architect, and again I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but the enterprise architect should take through all of these things with security underpinning all of this. So it's strategic input, influence decision makers, understand the budget, systems consultancy. I think that's a fairly generic list. I don't think there's anything particularly controversial in that list. But they should be taking the wider picture and weaving security to go all the way through it. But they should also have enough understanding to be able to say to the senior stakeholders, this is a risk, but this is how we're going to address it. It may not be a technical way of addressing it. It may be a procedural way or a physical way of addressing the risk, depending on budget, probability of the risk and all sorts of other things like that. But that's where the enterprise architect comes in. So to me, an enterprise architect is not purely about technical solution, it's about the whole picture for security. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a flavour for one tiny piece of architecture, security, that an architect should be looking at. How many of you have come across PKI? Public key. Oh, everybody. Oh, God. Okay, so secure email. Basically, this is secure email, secure communication between third party. In government terms, we call it secure email. Private sector, you tend to call it PKI. It enables authentication, non-repudiation, confidentiality, and integrity. And it's a system of messaging, so that the source message is confirmed as being accurate as per its receipt, and the sender and the receiver are confirmed as being the correct sender and receiver. So there's more technical that goes on with that. I've written some of it down, but you all come across it and you all know it. But that's the sort of thing that a security architect should be looking at. Do we need that? Do we need that? And they should be looking at that for both. So, like I said, public sector is called secure email, private sector is called PKI. Same principles. There's nothing much more I'm going to say on that one. So that's, I think I've talked quite fast actually. But that takes me on to my last slide, which I was going to open up to the floor to say, when? When do you think? So what I've done here is I've listed all the stages of delivery. And there's all sorts of questions. So I had a discussion. I've recently done Chartered Institute of Security Management a few months ago, and I was talking to the lecturer there, and he had completely different ideas to me as to when security architects. So he wasn't an architect. His background was risk management. He had completely different ideas to me as to when security should be considered in the architecture. He thought it should be around about design, halfway through, because he said that it should be there in people's heads, but it shouldn't actually be part, it should only come in as part of the design, not before then, because it's not really.
Are you going to ask the question? Because I was going to point out which one.
Yeah, okay, I'll ask the question. I'm just trying to give you some background, but I'll open it to the floor. Ask the question. Where do you think it should go?
Right at the initial concept.
And that's where I think it should go as well. But it was just interesting because a non-architect person thought, no, it should go further down.
It won't get there otherwise.
That was my argument. My argument was it needs to be right at the start because it shapes the business case, shapes the business analysis, it also shapes the budget. So, and it shapes the risk management. It means that the architect, the enterprise architect, can get a feeling for what the risk appetite is for that organisation. So that to me is where it should go. But
so two things. One is, I think you probably introduce it at the initial scoping stage. Someone can have a concept which is a generic idea of something you'd like to achieve, but you can't go much beyond the business case without having worked out what scale, what order of magnitude of impact this might have, and what level of security you need to have, and therefore what scale you can be. And the other is that that's a very sort of Prince 2 view of the world.
Yeah, I'm Prince 2, yeah.
Have you got a view of how that works in an agile model?
So I've worked with Agile as well. I tend to do a mix of either Prince 2 or Agile, depending on the organisation that I work with. And most of those stages are in one format or another within Agile as well. Within Agile, the way I've worked within Agile is you're constantly going back and reviewing the security, but you still define the security requirements up front, because that's where it affects the budgeting. That affects the scope and it affects the budgeting. But within Agile, I would continually review it and look to see is it actually appropriate within those particular cycles, because it's quite often people think it's got to be in the technical side of it, but if you can make it available, if you can develop security on the physical side or in the personnel controls, you don't actually need to represent it in the technical side, so you might be able to make money, not pay as much for it, or make it more flexible approach. But you're absolutely right, that's a Prince 2.
How would, so slightly diverted from what you're asking, but I'm just trying to think, so we are about to establish a enterprise cloud service for all our consumers, and as part of that initial setting up that service, all the security parameters, data classification, etc., and controls in place, we're going to establish up front. So then it is like a shop window for our customers to come and choose what service they want. So in that world, once you set it up once, then you have to really think about it.
You have to keep going over and over. Remember, you've got GDPR coming through, that's going to change some of it, but you've got to keep going back and over it. So what you should be doing is something called a business impact assessment. So you're looking at your data flows and you're looking at
yeah, so that's
points
where
are.
the data classification will come. But once you got that, then from a project, not program, but a project level, is all be taken care of.
I would say no. So I absolutely do it at this stage, but you've got to keep going back into it because you don't know. You're making the assumption that the project is going to be delivered as it is originally scoped. So every time you change your scope, it needs to be considered.
Correct.
Every time you start to populate with data, because you don't really know how much data is going to be used, you don't really know how the users are going to use what it is you're deploying until they start using it. Because users will always find ways around things, whether we like it or not. They're quite a troublesome group, really, users. But they always find ways around things. They never quite do things as you expected them. So to me, the security, one of the things I always do when I work for a new organisation, you introduce a security organisation into that group. So you're reviewing the original principles, you're reviewing the way you are with security, you're reviewing all your incidents, you're looking for your trends, and you're constantly going back as to where you are with security. Because people get lazy, find other ways of working, things don't quite work as they expect. But it's a continually iterative process. That's what I would say. It's not something that you do and then you walk away from. You do, you implement to a certain extent, and you go back and double check. And it's the whole thing about security is it's not something you just do and you walk. This is the whole thing with things like ISO 27001. You don't do and walk away.
Based on the demon side.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got to keep going back and going back and going back. And you've got to be able to evidence that you've got that structure and that organisation in place all the way through. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? No.
Brilliant. Thank you, Suzanne.